The triumphant sound of the wedding march faltered, then died completely. A single collective gasp swept through St. Patrick's Cathedral, a wave of shock that silenced 300 of New York's most powerful people. At the altar, Julian Vance felt the blood drain from his face. His perfectly rehearsed world, built on a foundation of ruthless efficiency and forgotten pain, tilted on its axis. He stared past his bride, past the sea of stunned faces, to the great oak doors at the back of the church. Framed in the light of those open doors stood the ghost he thought he had buried 8 years ago, Ilara. And beside her, their small hands held firmly in hers, were 2 small boys with his eyes. His face, a small clear voice, cut through the stunned silence, a voice that carried with devastating clarity. Mommy, one of the boys, asked, his finger pointing directly at Julian. "Is that him? Is that our dad?" Ilara looked across the cavernous church, her eyes locking with the man who had shattered her life, and with a quiet strength that condemned him more than any shout ever could, she answered, "Yes, sweetheart. That's your father. What would you do if the biggest secret of your life walked in at the worst possible moment?" The answer is never simple. Let me know your first thoughts in the comments below and subscribe, because this is only the beginning of a story about lies, love, and data that can never truly be deleted. The air in the boardroom was worth more than the private island Julian Vance had bought on a whim last year. It was a chilled, sterile, $100 million air, filtered to remove any trace of the world outside and any hint of human frailty. Julian stood before a pane of glass that overlooked Silicon Valley, a sprawling circuit board of dreams and disruptions. Behind him, the faces of his board members were reflected in the polished mahogany of the table, impassive, expectant, hungry. They were not here for good news. They were here for efficient news. On the holographic display shimmering in the center of the room, a single elegant phrase glowed: AI Optimization Initiative. It was a beautiful, clean euphemism for the digital ghost that was about to haunt 10,000 homes. A quiet, clinical culling. The Q3 projections are clear. Julian said, his voice steady, betraying none of the acid churning in his gut. By integrating the Genesis AI into our logistics and client management divisions, we increase efficiency by 42%. Redundancies will be significant. A man at the end of the table, a veteran from his father's era, shifted in his seat. Significant, Julian. The press is calling it a bloodbath. We're talking about laying off nearly a quarter of our workforce. These are people who built this company. My father built this company on innovation. Julian countered, his tone hardening. He didn't do it by clinging to the past. This is the next step. It is unavoidable. The words felt foreign in his own mouth, rehearsed a script written by the market itself. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of consensus, the sound of profit. 20 miles away, the air smelled of chalk dust, cheap coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of rain-soaked asphalt. Here, in the heart of a community that Progress had forgotten the Innovate Forward Community Center, was a riot of color and noise. It was Ilara's world, his wife's sanctuary. She knelt on the floor, her gentle hand guiding a little girl's fingers as she traced the letter B. The girl's mother, a woman named Maria, watched them with eyes hollowed out by sleepless nights. "He's worked at the Innovate warehouse for 15 years, Maria whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Now, they say a machine can do his job better. They say his whole shift might be optimized. What do we do, Ilara? What does a word like that even mean for people like us?" Ilara looked up, her heart clenching with a familiar ache. She didn't tell Maria that her own husband was the architect of that optimization. She didn't tell her that the man who kissed her good morning was the same man whose decisions were creating this tidal wave of fear. She simply squeezed Maria's hand. "It means we fight," she said softly. "It means we learn new skills. We won't let anyone be forgotten." Later that evening, the sterile silence of their minimalist mansion felt louder than the chaos of Ilara's community center. Julian was slumped on the sofa, the glow of his tablet casting long shadows on his face. He looked up as Ilara entered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I think my brain has been replaced by a spreadsheet." Ilara smiled, a genuine warm smile that felt like the only real thing in the room. She glided over a glass of wine in her hand. "Well," she said, her voice a soft melody, "this spreadsheet looks like it needs a system reboot. The wine update is now installing." Julian chuckled, a rare, tired sound. He took the glass, his fingers brushing against hers. For a moment, the CEO vanished, and he was just a man finding refuge in his wife's grace. This was their ritual, a quiet strength against his loud, demanding world. The peace was shattered by the arrival of his mother. Eleanor Vance was a woman carved from ice and ambition. She swept into the room, her presence immediately lowering the temperature. She kissed Julian's cheek, a gesture as flawless and cold as the diamond on her finger, before turning her gaze to Ilara. "Darling," she began, her voice like honey laced with frost. "I saw the news. The Titan of Tech makes his boldest move yet. Your father would be impressed in his own way." They sat for dinner, an affair of perfect porcelain and strained conversation. Eleanor spoke of legacy, of strength, of the hard choices leaders must make. Her words were aimed at Julian, but her eyes, sharp and calculating, were fixed on Ilara. Julian, buoyed by the wine, and his wife's presence, began to talk about Ilara's work at the center, his voice filled with a pride that felt like a distant memory. "She's building something real, Mother. Something with heart." Eleanor placed her fork down with surgical precision. She looked at her son, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Your father," she said, her voice, dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, also had a very big heart. He had grand dreams, projects to help the little man, before he left me to manage this empire alone. A man needs focus, Julian. A leader cannot be distracted by sentiment. He must be a giant, and giants cast long, cold shadows. The implication was clear. Ilara, with her garden of charity and kindness, was the sentiment. She was the distraction. Julian fell silent, the earlier warmth draining from his face. The weight of his mother's words, of his father's legacy, settled over him like a shroud. Ilara watched the exchange, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. She saw the invisible cracks forming in the foundation of their love. She saw the battle lines being drawn. Later, long after Ilara had fallen into a restless sleep, Julian stood once more by the great glass window in his home office. The city lights below twinkled like a fallen constellation, each light a home, a life, a story he was rewriting with cold, efficient code. He felt his mother's words echoing in his mind, twisting around the desperate whispers he heard from Ilara's world. He was a giant, standing on the edge of a silent valley he had created, and for the first time in a long time, he felt terrifyingly, utterly alone. The days that followed were a study in polite fiction. Julian and Ilara moved through their life with the careful choreography of two people pretending a chasm had not just opened at their feet. They smiled. They passed the salt at the dinner table. They spoke of trivialities, the weather, the traffic, the mundane logistics of a shared existence. But beneath the surface, the chill from that first dinner with Eleanor, lingered a low-grade fever in the heart of their home. The cracks began to appear not as a sudden shatter, but as fine, almost invisible fissures. It started with an email. Julian was in his office, the city a silent, glittering panorama below, when a message from his mother slid into his inbox. The subject line was a single innocent word, "Faded a perspective." Inside was a forwarded letter, ostensibly sent to Eleanor from a long-tenured engineer who had just been optimized. The man's words were a torrent of grief and rage, painting Julian as a heartless butcher of dreams, a son who had betrayed his father's legacy. But the final paragraph was the true poison. "At least I know some good still exists in your family, Eleanor," the letter read. "My wife went to the Innovate Forward Center yesterday. She said Mrs. Vancellara was like an angel. She gave our daughter books and told my wife not to give up hope. It's a comfort to know that while one Vance is taking away our future, another is trying to give it back." Julian's jaw tightened. He read the lines again, then a third time. The words were a masterclass in manipulation. It positioned his wife not as his partner, but as his moral antithesis, the saint to his sinner. He felt a hot, unreasonable flash of resentment. It wasn't fair. He was the one taking the arrows, making the impossible calls, while she got to be the angel of hope. The email had done its work. It had planted a seed of division, making her goodness feel like a judgment against him. That evening, Elara tried to bridge the growing distance. She'd sent the housekeeper home early, filled the house with the scent of roasted chicken and rosemary, and opened the bottle of wine they'd saved from their anniversary. It was an attempt to reclaim the quiet intimacy that had once been their sanctuary. Julian walked in his shoulders, slumped with the weight of another brutal day. He saw the table, the candles, the hope in her eyes, and for a moment his own heart ached with the desire to simply fall into her arms and forget the world. And then his phone rang. It was Eleanor. Her voice was a symphony of manufactured panic. "Julian, darling, I am so sorry to bother you. I know it's your evening with Elara. But David Chen from the Singapore acquisition is threatening to pull out. He's saying the AI transition is too unstable. He'll only speak with you. I tried to handle it, but he needs the giant." Her words were a cage wrapped in the velvet of necessity. "Elara will understand," she added, the final perfect twist of the knife. "She's always so wonderfully supportive of your duties." Julian closed his eyes. It was a lie. He knew on some level that it was a lie, a fabricated crisis. But it was a lie he couldn't call out without looking paranoid, without disrespecting his mother in front of a key investor. He was trapped. "I'll be there in an hour," he said, his voice flat. He turned to Elara, the apology already dying on his lips. "I'm sorry. I have to go." She didn't argue. She simply blew out the candles, one by one, the small flames vanishing into smoke and the warmth in the room vanishing with them. When Julian returned 3 hours later, the house was dark and silent. The food was cold on the counter. Elara was in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the city lights. The crisis was handled. He said the words, sounding hollow even to himself. She turned to him, her eyes not angry, but filled with a profound sadness that was somehow worse. "There's always a crisis, isn't there, Julian? Another fire to put out. Another deal to save. Tell me," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "when is it our turn? When do we become the crisis you rush home to solve?" The exhaustion and guilt of the past weeks finally boiled over in him. "You think I want this?" He shot back, his voice rising. "You think I enjoy any of this? I'm trying to hold together an empire that provides for the very life you seem so eager to criticize." "I am not criticizing our life," she said, standing now, her own voice gaining strength. I am asking for my husband back. The man I married wouldn't let his mother orchestrate his life and his company sabotage our dinner. My mother is trying to help. Your mother is trying to isolate you. Can't you see it? What I see, he said the words sharp and cruel, echoing the poison he hadn't realized he'd swallowed, is that maybe you don't understand the pressure. Maybe it's easy to have such a big heart when you're not the one making the impossible choices that keep it all from falling apart. The words struck her like a physical blow. She flinched her face, paling. It was the first time he had ever used her compassion as a weapon against her. She stared at him, a stranger wearing her husband's face. The fight ended there. There was nothing left to say. The crack was no longer invisible. It was a deep, jagged fault line running right through the center of their marriage. Later that night, Julian lay awake in the cold expanse of their bed, listening to the soft, even rhythm of Ilara's breathing. She had turned away from him in her sleep. He reached out a hand, wanting to touch her, to pull her back, to erase the last few hours, the last few weeks. But he let his hand fall back to his side. An invisible wall now stood between them, built of doubt and exhaustion, and words that could never be unsaid. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he had no idea how to tear it down. The silence in the house had become a living entity, a third resident in their marriage. It sat between them at breakfast, it walked the halls at night, and it lay in the vast, cold space in their bed. It was in this suffocating quiet that Ilara first felt it, a subtle, unfamiliar shift within her own body, a flutter of life that was both impossible and undeniable. A home test confirmed it. 2. The instructions were clinical, the results absolute. She sank onto the cold marble of the bathroom floor, one hand flying to her mouth, the other instinctively covering her stomach. Tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of fierce, unadulterated joy. Twins. In the wreckage of her marriage, a secret, beautiful garden was beginning to grow. This, she thought, this would be the lifeline. This would be the anchor to pull Julian back from the abyss. It changed everything. Her mission was no longer just to save her husband, but to protect the future of her children, to ensure they would know the good man she had married, not the cold titan he was becoming. She did not rush to him with the news. She knew words were not enough. She needed to give him one last chance to choose the right path on his own. She spent 2 days in a fever of work, not at the community center, but at her desk. She researched, she compiled data. She spoke to economists who specialized in ethical transitions. The result was a slim professional folder. It was not a plea. It was a proposal. She found him in his study, staring at a wall of monitors displaying shifting market data. He looked like a king surveying a kingdom of ghosts. "Julian," she said, her voice calm and even. She placed the folder on his desk. "I know you're under pressure. I'm not here to fight. I'm here to help." He looked at the folder, then at her, his eyes wary. "What is this?" "It's a plan," she explained. "A proposal for a transition fund. An Innovate Forward initiative to retrain every single employee affected by the AI rollout. It shows how we can invest in our people, turn this PR nightmare into a story of corporate responsibility, and still meet our efficiency targets within 2 years. It's all there. The numbers work." Inside, she had also tucked the stories of 3 families, including Maria's, their photos clipped to the pages. She was giving him data, but she was also giving him faces. He opened it, his eyes scanning the pages with the detached speed of a CEO. He saw the charts, the projections. He saw the faces. For a fleeting second, she saw a flicker of the old Julian, the man who would have been moved, the man who would have been proud. But the flicker died, smothered by the weight of his new reality. He closed the folder and pushed it back across the desk. "Ilara, I appreciate the effort. Really, I do," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "But I have a team of analysts for this. This isn't your concern. This isn't your concern." The words echoed in the space between them, more final than any shouting match. He was no longer seeing her as his partner, but as an outsider. An amateur, dabbling in his world of giants. The warning had been delivered, and it had been ignored. "I see," she said, her voice quiet, but not defeated. She took the folder from the desk. "Thank you for your time, Julian." She did not go to their bedroom. She walked straight to the guest wing where she knew Eleanor was staying for the week. She found her mother-in-law in the sitting room, reading a biography of a ruthless industrialist. Eleanor looked up, a placid smile on her face. "Ilara, dear. Is everything all right? No." Ilara said, her voice ringing with a clarity that made Eleanor's smile falter. "It isn't." She stood before the older woman, no longer a gentle daughter-in-law, but an equal. "I know what you're doing, Eleanor. You're whispering poison in his ear. You're using his father's memory to justify this coldness. You're trying to break him down so you can rebuild him in your own image." The mask of civility slipped from Eleanor's face, revealing the raw shock beneath. She had underestimated this girl. Ilara took a step closer. "But let me be clear. He is not your late husband, and he is not your property. He is my husband, and I will not stand by and watch you destroy the good man I know is still inside him." For a long moment, Eleanor was speechless. The raw audacity, the perception, it was infuriating. Then the shock hardened into something else, something cold and reptilian. A slow, chilling smile spread across her lips. "My dear, you have a very vivid imagination. You must be under a great deal of stress." The condescension was Ilara's dismissal. She knew then that there was no reasoning with this woman. There was only war. Ilara turned and left without another word. Eleanor watched her go, her knuckles white, as she gripped her book. The girl was stronger than she'd thought, more dangerous. The gentle approach had failed. It was time for a more permanent solution. A solution that would sever the tie so completely it could never be mended. She waited until she heard the distant click of Ilara's bedroom door closing. Then she pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved with practiced speed, dialing a number she knew by heart. A man's voice answered on the other end. Richard. Eleanor said, her voice now smooth as silk, but with an edge like splintered ice. "A change of plans. It seems we need to accelerate our timeline." She paused, a predator savoring the final moment before the strike. "The time has come. We need to end this. Tonight." Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing. Ilara knew this, yet she allowed herself to hold it. She let it guide her hands as she set the table with their best china, the plates they had used on their first anniversary. She let it choose the music, a soft instrumental piece from a forgotten film they both loved. It was in the scent of the lamb, roasting slowly in the oven, in the deep red of the wine, breathing in its decanter, and in the soft, flickering candlelight that danced across the room, chasing away the shadows. On the table beside Julian's plate sat a small, perfectly wrapped gift box. Inside was a universe, a grainy black and white photograph of two tiny pulsing stars in a dark sky. Her sons. Their sons. This was not a plea. It was a sacrament. A truth so pure and powerful, she believed it could heal the world, or at least their small part of it. This would be the night he remembered the man he was not, the machine he was becoming. Across the city, in the steel and glass spire of Innovate Forward, Julian Vance was presiding over a funeral. There were no caskets, only a stack of manila envelopes, each one a death certificate for a career. The final list of layoffs. He had just come from the conference call with Human Resources, a conversation so steeped in corporate jargon and legal shielding that the word person was never mentioned. They were resource allocations, synergistic downsizes, human capital recalibrations. He felt nothing. That was the terrifying part. A deep, hollow numbness had settled in his chest where a conscience used to be. He walked to the private bar in his office, the one his father had installed, and poured a generous measure of scotch into a heavy crystal tumbler. The amber liquid burned a path down his throat, the first thing he had truly felt all day. He looked at his reflection in the dark window, a silhouette of a man in $1,000 suit, a king of a silent, desolate kingdom. He felt a surge of self-loathing so potent it made him nauseous. He was the villain in 1,000 stories tonight. When he finally walked through the door of his home, the warmth and the soft music hit him like a physical force. He saw the table, the candles, Alara emerging from the kitchen, a hopeful, radiant smile on her face. For a single breathtaking moment, he felt a pull toward that light, a desperate yearning for the peace only she could offer. Then he saw his mother. Eleanor was standing by the fireplace, her back to the door. She was not dressed in her usual immaculate attire. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and she held a hand to her chest as if in pain. Beside her, looking deeply uncomfortable in his expensive suit, stood Richard Davies, a senior partner from one of their venture capital firms. Julian, Eleanor said, turning. Her voice was a choked, theatrical gasp. "Thank God you're home." Julian's weary mind snapped to high alert. "Mother." "What's going on, Richard? What are you doing here? I don't know," Richard stammered, avoiding Julian's eyes. "Eleanor, you said Alara wanted to discuss." He misunderstood, Julian, Eleanor wailed, cutting him off and rushing to her son's side. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Alara, she invited him here. She said she wanted to discuss a donation for her center. Then she left us alone. She said she needed to check on dinner." Her voice broke into a sob. He thought I was available. He thought she was offering me to him as some kind of party favor. The world tilted on its axis. The accusation was so monstrous, so utterly insane, that Julian's stressed, alcohol-laced mind couldn't process it logically. He could only feel it. The heat of it. The betrayal. What Alara said, her voice, a faint whisper from the kitchen doorway. She was holding a serving spoon, her face, a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. "No, that's not. I never said that." "He's lying," Eleanor sobbed, pointing a trembling finger at Richard. "She planned this whole thing. She locked us in here together." "That is not true," Alara's voice cracked with desperation. She dropped the spoon, which clattered loudly on the marble floor. "Julian, you have to believe me. Your mother brought him here. I was preparing a romantic evening for us. Because I have something wonderful to tell you." But the word wonderful was a spark on a field of gasoline. Wonderful Julian's voice was dangerously quiet, the numbness in his chest now replaced by a white-hot rage. He looked from his sobbing mother to the flustered, guilty-looking man, and then to his wife, whose pleas now sounded to his poisoned ears like the frantic denials of the court. All the resentment of the past weeks, all the pressure, all the self-hatred found a target. "You orchestrate this filth in my home with my mother, and you dare to call it wonderful," he snarled, advancing on her. "Julian, no, please, just listen. She begged, tears now streaming down her face. The gift on the table. Just open the gift. "I am done with your games," he roared. "I am done with your lies." The image from the email flashed in his mind. The angel of the community. The saint. It was all a lie. A beautiful, hypocritical mask. "I don't know who you are anymore." He turned on his heel and strode to his study. The air crackled with unspoken violence. Ilara stood, frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't happening. This was a nightmare. He returned less than a minute later. In his hand was a thick manila envelope. His face was a stone mask. "My lawyer drew these up last week," he said, his voice dead, devoid of all emotion. "My mother. She tried to warn me. She saw the signs. I just didn't want to believe her." He threw the envelope onto the perfectly set dining table. It skidded across the polished wood and came to a stop right beside the small, beautifully wrapped gift box. I guess he said the final words delivered like a judge's sentence. "We're done here. Divorce papers." The words on the tab were stark and brutal. He had prepared them. Weeks ago, while she was planning their future, he was planning their end. Ilara looked from the cold, legal document to the small, hopeful box. Inside that box was a universe. Outside of it, her own had just been annihilated. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a cold, hollow calm. There were no more tears to cry. There was nothing left. Without a word, she picked up her purse from the entryway table. She gave one last, lingering look at the unopened gift, the secret of their sons nestled inside a truth that would now go unheard. Then she turned, opened the front door, and walked out into the cold, unforgiving night. 8 years is a lifetime. Or it is no time at all. It is long enough for a wound to scar over, but not long enough to forget the blade. In New York, Julian Vance became a legend. He graced the cover of Forbes, his gaze as cold and sharp as the city's winter skyline. The headline read, "The Man Who Taught a Machine to Think." His AI genesis had revolutionized global logistics, and in doing so, had made him one of the wealthiest men on the planet. He lived in a penthouse that felt more like a museum than a home, a silent, sprawling space filled with art he never looked at, and rooms he never entered. He worked with the relentless precision of a machine, his days a blur of data acquisitions and decisions that moved markets. He had everything a man could want, and he had nothing at all. Every night in the hollow silence of his success, he was haunted by the ghost of a woman's smile and the echo of a door closing softly in the rain. In a sun-drenched cottage overlooking the turquoise waters of Bondi Beach, Australia, Ilara Vance had rebuilt a life from the ashes of another. She was no longer just a philanthropist. She was a respected consultant, a sought-after voice on ethical technology, a woman who taught corporations how to innovate with a conscience. But her greatest creation, her true legacy, could be found in the sound of 2 young boys laughing as they chased each other through the garden. Ryan and Riley. They were 8 years old, a whirlwind of boundless energy and startling intelligence. Ryan had her gentle nature, but his father's contemplative eyes. Riley had her grace, but his father's mischievous, lopsided grin. They were living, breathing echoes of a love Julian thought he had erased. Every day, Ilara looked at them, and her heart both broke and healed in the same beat. The past arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the day's ordinary mail. It was a single envelope nestled between a local utility bill and a postcard from a friend. The paper was thick, expensive cream, the kind that feels heavy in your hand. Her name was written across the front in elegant looping calligraphy, Mrs. Ilara Vance. And in the top left corner, the return address that made her blood run cold, Eleanor Vance, Park Avenue, New York. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. Inside, an embossed card fell into her palm like a small, perfectly cut stone. Eleanor Vance and Marcus Hartwell request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their children, Julian Alexander Vance and Sienna Hartwell. The date was 3 weeks away. St. Patrick's Cathedral, a power merger disguised as a sacrament. Elara's knees felt weak, and she gripped the kitchen counter to steady herself. He was getting married. After all this time, he was moving on, cementing his life in the cold, transactional world his mother had always wanted for him. Tucked behind the invitation was a smaller, personal note written in Eleanor's immaculate, spidery script. My dear Elara, I thought you should know that Julian has finally found true happiness with a woman who is suited to his world. Sienna is a wonderful girl from a fine family. They are a perfect match. I know it must be difficult, but I do hope you can find it in your heart to be happy for him. He deserves to finally put the past behind him. Fondly, Eleanor. The cruelty was breathtaking. It was not an invitation. It was a final victorious blow, a confirmation of her defeat sent across an ocean. Eleanor wanted her to know she had lost. Mommy, what's that? She hadn't heard them come in. Ryan stood there, his blue eyes, Julian's eyes wide with curiosity. He pointed at the card in her hand. Before she could hide it, he leaned in, his reading skills improving every day. His small face went pale as he pieced the words together. Julian, Alexander. Vance? He read slowly. He looked up at her, his expression shattering her heart into a million pieces. Mommy, is that about our dad? The question hung in the sunlit kitchen, heavy and devastating. Yes, sweetheart, she whispered, unable to lie. It is. Riley, seeing his brother's distress, came closer, his eyes filled with tears. He's getting married to someone else, he asked, his voice trembling. But we thought someday he would come find us. You said he was a good man who just lost his way. He doesn't want us, does he? Ryan asked, the simple, brutal logic of a child cutting through everything. He doesn't care that we're here. That was the line she could not let stand. She knelt, pulling both of them into her arms, their small bodies trembling against hers. No, my darlings, that's not it, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. Your father doesn't know you exist. They pulled back their faces, a mixture of confusion and dawning hope. He doesn't know, Ryan whispered. I tried to tell him the night I left. She explained the truth, finally spilling out. But things were broken between us. He wouldn't have believed me. Riley's face, wet with tears, suddenly lit up with a child's unwavering clarity. Then we have to go tell him, he said urgently. If he doesn't know, we have to show him. We have to go to the wedding and show him we're real. The thought was terrifying. The thought was impossible. And the thought was absolutely, undeniably right. For 8 years, she had hidden. She had protected her sons by creating a safe, quiet world, far from the wreckage of the past. But hiding had not healed the wound, it had only covered it. Her sons deserved more than a ghost story about a lost prince. They deserved the chance to look their father in the eye. And Julian, whatever his sins, deserved to know that his legacy was not in lines of code, but in the heartbeats of his 2 beautiful sons. She owed it to them, and she owed it to herself, to stand before him not as the broken girl who fled in the night, but as the woman she had become, strong, successful, and the mother of his children. She looked into the 2 pairs of hopeful, pleading eyes that were a perfect reflection of the man she had never truly stopped loving. Her own resolve hardened a quiet fire igniting in her soul. Later that evening, long after the boys were asleep, Ilara sat at her laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating her determined face. She navigated to an airline website. 3 tickets, Sydney to New York. The dates were set. The price was astronomical. She didn't hesitate. Her finger hovered over the mouse, a deep, steadying breath filling her lungs. Then she clicked. The screen flashed. Booking confirmed. The storm was coming home. St. Patrick's Cathedral was not a house of God today. It was a stage, a magnificent, cold stage for the performance of a merger between 2 dynasties. 300 of New York's elite, a veritable forest of old money and new power, sat in the polished pews, their whispers rustling like dry leaves. Sunlight fractured into 1,000 jeweled colors by the stained glass windows, illuminated floating dust motes in the cavernous air. It was all breathtakingly beautiful and breathtakingly hollow. At the altar, Julian Vance stood like a statue sculpted from grief. In his perfectly tailored tuxedo, he looked every inch the conquering CEO. But inside his soul was a barren landscape. As the organ began to swell a deep, resonant prelude to the bride's arrival, his mind betrayed him. It fled from the cold grandeur of the present and took refuge in the warm memory of a simple garden wedding 8 years ago. He saw Ilara, her face radiant, walking toward him, not as a partner in a transaction, but as the other half of his soul. The great oak doors at the back of the cathedral swung open. A collective muted gasp rippled through the congregation. But it was not for the bride. Framed in the column of afternoon light stood a woman who was both a ghost and a startling reality. It was Ilara. Older, yes, but imbued with a quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her, a grace that time had refined, not diminished. And she was not alone. On either side of her, their small hands held firmly in hers, stood 2 8-year-old boys. 2 boys who were a living, breathing testament to a truth he had long ago buried. 2 boys who were so uncannily, devastatingly like him that it stole the air from Julian's lungs. They had his dark hair, his jawline, his way of standing with his shoulders squared. They were a mirror reflecting a life he had never lived. At the altar, Julian's vision tunneled. The faces of the guests, the priest, the elaborate floral arrangements, it all blurred into an indistinct haze. The only thing in focus was the impossible trinity at the end of the aisle. The world fell silent, and all he could hear was the frantic, panicked thrumming of his own heart. Sienna the bride had started her walk down a side aisle, but she too had stopped her face, a mask of confusion. The organ music faltered, then died completely. The silence that filled the cathedral was absolute, profound, and heavy with impending catastrophe. It was Riley, the more adventurous twin, who broke it. His small voice, clear and unafraid, carried through the cavernous space. "Is that him, Mummy?" he whispered loud enough for the first 10 rows to hear. He pointed a small finger directly at the man at the altar. "Is that our dad?" Ilara knelt slightly, her gaze locked on Julian's across the vast expanse of the church. Her voice, when she answered, was not a whisper. It was a clear, steady bell of truth that shattered the silence into 1,000,000 pieces. "Yes, sweetheart. That's your father." A wave of frantic whispers erupted through the pews. Phones were discreetly raised. The society photographers, sensing the scandal of the decade, began to move their flashes like silent bursts of lightning. Julian felt his knees buckle. Father. The word was an earthquake in his mind. He was a father. He had been a father for 8 years. These beautiful, impossible children were his. Julian Sienna hissed beside him, her perfectly manicured hand gripping his arm. What is the meaning of this? But he couldn't answer her. He couldn't feel her grip. He took a single stumbling step forward, his eyes never leaving the two small faces, staring back at him with a mixture of awe, hope, and nervous curiosity. In the front pew, Eleanor sat frozen, her face ashen. This was not the plan. The invitation was meant to be a final cruel taunt, a ghost sent to haunt a wedding. She had not planned for the ghost to bring an army. Elara began to walk down the aisle. It was the most surreal procession the cathedral had ever witnessed. Not a bride in white, but an ex-wife in navy blue, flanked by two living, breathing consequences. As they drew closer, Julian could see the details: Ryan's quiet intensity, Riley's restless energy. They were him. They were Elara. They were perfect. Sienna finally understood. Her face cycled from confusion to disbelief to a cold, hard fury. "Stop this," she commanded, her voice a sharp crack in the chaotic air. "I will not have my wedding ruined by my children." Julian's voice was a raw, broken whisper, yet it carried with devastating authority. "By my sons." The admission hung in the air, a public confession. It was over. Sienna stared at him, her eyes blazing with humiliation. Without another word, she turned her long white train, sweeping across the marble, and walked out of the cathedral, a queen abandoning a fallen kingdom. Elara and the boys had reached the altar now. Ryan, the more serious twin, looked up at Julian, his blue eyes filled with a wisdom far beyond his years. "Mommy told us stories about a prince who lost his way," he said seriously. "We always hoped you would find your way back to us." The innocent words finally broke what was left of Julian's composure. He sank to his knees on the cold stone floor, right there at the altar, where he was to have started a new life, and openly wept. He reached out a trembling hand, not yet daring to touch them. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, the words torn from the depths of his soul. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." The cathedral slowly emptied, the guests scattering like startled birds eager to spread the tale. Soon only the four of them remained, and the lone, rigid figure of Eleanor in the front pew. "Take them outside," Julian said quietly to Elara, his voice thick with tears. "Wait for me on the steps. What I have to say to my mother is not for children's ears." Elara nodded, her own eyes glistening, and gently guided the boys away. When the heavy doors closed behind them, Julian rose to his feet. He turned to face the woman who had authored his ruin. The silence in the empty cathedral was now an indictment. Why, he asked, his voice deadly calm. Eleanor finally stood, gathering the shreds of her composure. "I did it for you, Julian, to protect you. She was a weakness, a distraction from your destiny, my destiny." He laughed, a bitter, broken sound that echoed off the stone vaults. "My destiny was to be a husband and a father. My destiny was in a small gift box she left on the dining room table 8 years ago. A box I never opened. A box you probably threw away with the rest of the garbage. She would have ruined you. She was me." He roared, the sound thundering through the empty space. "She was the best part of me and you. You took a scalpel to my soul and cut her out. You let me believe lies. You watched me grieve for 8 years, knowing I had 2 sons in this world. You let me live in this empty, hollow shell of a life you designed for me." He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a cold, clear fire she had never seen before. "You sent her that invitation, didn't you? One last cruel little twist of the knife." Her silence was his answer. "You didn't do it to protect me," Julian said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, each word a shard of ice. "You did it to own me. Because you are a black hole of need and fear, and you couldn't stand to see me happy in a light that wasn't your own." "Julian," I am your mother." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a mother, but a stranger. A frightened, lonely woman who had devoured her own son's happiness to feed her emptiness. "No," he said, the finality in his tone sealing the fate of their relationship. "You are not. A mother doesn't do this." He turned his back on her, the sound of his footsteps echoing on the marble. He paused at the door without looking back. "Don't contact me again. Don't call. Don't write. Don't come to my office. We are done." He took a deep breath. "As far as I'm concerned, I no longer have a mother." He walked out into the afternoon sun, leaving Eleanor Vance utterly alone in the vast, magnificent and silent cathedral, a queen reigning over nothing at all. Rebuilding a life is not like building a skyscraper. There are no blueprints. There is no grand design. There is only the slow, painstaking work of laying one brick of trust upon another and hoping the foundation holds. Their first family outing was to get ice cream. It was a ridiculously normal thing to do after a week of earth-shattering revelations, and that was precisely why Julian suggested it. They sat at a small, sticky table in a Greenwich Village parlour, the air thick with the smell of sugar and possibility. The boys thrilled and chattering debated the merits of cookie dough versus mint chocolate chip. Julian and Ilara watched them, a fragile silence between them. Julian, trying to be the perfect father, turned to the boys with a serious expression. "Now remember what the doctor said. Not too much sugar. You should both get the frozen yogurt with fruit." Ryan and Riley exchanged a look. Ryan, the diplomat, then leaned over to his mother and whispered, just loud enough for Julian to hear, "Mum, I think the Dad software update is a little buggy. Can we send it back for the version that likes French fries?" Ilara suppressed a laugh, but her eyes danced with the first genuine amusement Julian had seen in what felt like a lifetime. Julian himself chuckled a real unburdened sound. "The software is learning," he said, ruffling Ryan's hair. "Let's get the boys some real ice cream." It was a small concession, a single wobbly brick laid in place. Weeks later, Julian Vance stood on a different kind of stage. There was no altar, no flowers, just a simple podium and a sea of cameras. The world was watching, waiting for the disgraced titan of tech to explain himself. He had invited Ilara. She sat in the front row, her expression neutral, her presence a silent question. He began to speak, his voice clear and steady, devoid of the corporate jargon he had once hidden behind. He did not make excuses. He took full accountability for the thousands of lives his decisions had upended. He spoke of pursuing efficiency at the cost of his own humanity. For the past 8 years, he said, his eyes finding Ilara's in the crowd, "I have been celebrated for building an empire of logic and data. But I have come to learn that a life without empathy is the most inefficient model of all. It is a bankrupt existence." Then he announced the Innovate with Heart initiative, a foundation funded with 1/4 of his personal fortune, dedicated to retraining every worker displaced by technology, starting with the ones his own company had let go. He announced a new ethical charter for his company, a promise to balance progress with people. It was a public repentance, a promise to the world, but everyone in the room knew he was speaking to an audience of one. As he stepped away from the podium, Ilara met his gaze, and for the first time since she had walked back into his life, he saw a flicker of the pride she used to look at him with. The bricks were slowly finding their places. One evening a month later, they were in the small apartment Ilara had rented, going over plans for the foundation. Julian, energized and passionate in a way she hadn't seen since their early days, was sketching out an idea on a whiteboard. "And if we partner with the community colleges, we can create a direct pipeline. We can guarantee jobs. These people won't be left behind. Ilara, I'll make sure of it." He gestured emphatically with his hand to make a point, and Ilara flinched. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible motion, a slight pulling back of her shoulders, a brief tensing of her jaw, a subconscious echo of another night in another room when his raised hand had not been filled with excitement, but with rage. He saw it. The passion drained from his face, replaced by a look of such profound pain that it made her ache. He slowly lowered his arm. The silence in the room was deafening. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Oh God, Ilara. I'm so sorry." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "It's okay, Julian," she said softly, and she meant it. "It's not you. Not anymore. It's just a ghost. It takes time for ghosts to fade." He nodded, turning his hand over to grip hers, his thumb stroking her knuckles. He understood. Trust was not a switch to be flipped. It was a scar to be healed. He would wait. He would spend the rest of his life waiting, if that's what it took. He proposed to her a month after that. There was no diamond ring, no grand romantic gesture. He came to her apartment and laid the official charter for the Innovate with Heart Foundation on her kitchen table. He pointed to the top of the page. Co-chair, Julian Vance. And right beneath it, co-chair, Ilara Vance. "I destroyed our family in the pursuit of my work," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Now I want to use my work to rebuild it. With you. I don't want to just be the boy's father, Ilara. I want to be your husband again. I want us to build a legacy, together. A legacy our sons can actually be proud of." He looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears, his heart laid bare. "Help me run this. Help me do some good in this world. Marry me, Ilara, and help me rebuild our fortress." She looked at the paper, at the two names side by side. She looked at the man before her, no longer a giant of industry, but a man humbled by loss and remade by love. A man who was finally, truly home. "Yes," she whispered, tears of her own beginning to fall. "Yes, I will." 1 year later, the setting was not a cathedral nor a beach. It was a crowded auditorium at a local community college. On the stage, Julian and Ilara were handing out certificates to the first graduating class of the Innovate with Heart Retraining program. The applause was thunderous. In the front row, Ryan and Riley were cheering wildly for their parents. After the ceremony, the four of them walked out into the warm evening air, mingling with the crowd of graduates and their families. Julian's hand found Ilara's, their fingers intertwining naturally, easily. He was no longer a king in a glass tower, and she was no longer an angel in a quiet garden. They were simply two people walking together, their son's laughter lighting the way. Their love story was not a fairy tale that had been perfectly restored. It was a fortress rebuilt stone by stone from the ruins of their past, and its walls were stronger than ever, cemented by forgiveness, fortified by patience, and filled with the joyous, unwavering truth that some data, the data of the human heart, can never truly be deleted. Their story reminds us that the strongest fortresses aren't built of stone and steel, but of forgiveness, patience, and the courage to rebuild. It leaves us with a question that echoes in our own hyper-efficient, data-driven world. How do we make sure we don't delete the human connections that truly define us? Perhaps we all have a silent valley in our own lives, a past mistake that echoes a relationship that needs mending, waiting for a brave step toward healing. This journey of Julian and Ilara left us with so much to think about, and we imagine it might have for you too. We'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below. Do you believe Julian truly earned his second chance? Or are some mistakes too great to ever be fully forgiven? What part of their story resonated with you the most? We are also always striving to make these stories more powerful and meaningful. If you have any thoughts on today's narrative or ideas for how we can improve our storytelling in the future, your feedback would be an incredible gift to us. If their journey to rebuild touched your heart, please leave a like to let us know. And if you feel this story might bring a little hope or understanding to someone else, consider sharing it with them. To join us on more emotional journeys like this one, be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so we can continue to explore these meaningful stories together. Until next time, take care of your stories and each other.